My name is Zephyr Moonshadow, and I attend what is supposedly the most prestigious educational institution in the entire Andromeda sector, Galactic Academy Prime. What a joke that name turned out to be. Prime. More like primal if you ask me, but nobody ever does because I am what you might generously call a background character in the grand theater of interspecies education. The Academy sits on an artificial moon orbiting the gas giant Nexus 7, all gleaming spires and crystalline domes that look impressive in the recruitment hollows. 347 different species attend classes here, from the microscopic quantum sprites who need magnification just to be seen, to the massive boulder folk who require specially reinforced seating. It is meant to be a beacon of unity, cooperation and higher learning among the galaxy's diverse civilizations. Unfortunately, nobody told Brandon Torres about the cooperation part. Brandon Torres stands exactly 12 feet and 4 inches tall. Not that anyone has been brave enough to measure him directly. We all just estimated from a safe distance, preferably from behind reinforced barriers. He hails from Dracanus Prime, where apparently natural selection decided that subtlety was for weaklings, and opted instead for creatures that looked like they were designed by a committee of nightmare enthusiasts with unlimited budgets for teeth and claws. His species, the Draconians, are what polite xenobiologists call apex predators. What the rest of us call them involves significantly more colorful language, and usually ends with prayers to whatever deities we hold dear. Brandon's particular subspecies evolved specifically to hunt things that were bigger, faster, and theoretically smarter than they were. The key word here being theoretically. I am from Herbania 6, where our most dangerous predator is the snapping dandelion, which mostly just gives you a mild rash if you step on it wrong. My species, the Verdanians, evolved from peaceful grazers who spent millions of years perfecting the art of running away from anything with more teeth than a dinner fork. We are excellent at hiding, fantastic at finding the best grass, and absolutely spectacular at identifying exits in any given room. This makes me uniquely qualified to appreciate just how terrifying Brandon Torres truly is. Brandon does not just intimidate students, he has turned intimidation into an art form. A carefully choreographed dance of psychological and occasionally physical destruction. Last semester he convinced a crystalline student named Shimmer to literally crack under pressure during a debate about economic policy. The semester before that, he made 3 different aquatic species students dry up from stress-induced dehydration just by looking at them wrong. His reputation precedes him like a storm front. When Brandon walks down the corridors of Galactic Academy Prime, conversations stop, students flee, and even the automated maintenance drones seem to find urgent business elsewhere. The Rikis pretends not to notice because technically, he has never violated any specific school rules. There is apparently nothing in the student handbook about creating an atmosphere of existential terror through sheer presence alone. Brandon's favorite hunting ground is Universal Literature class, taught by Commander Tom Marley, a well-meaning Centaurian who believes that great literature can bridge any cultural divide. Commander Marley has been teaching for 43 years and has somehow maintained his optimism despite overwhelming evidence that some cultural divides exist specifically because certain cultures prefer their bridges made out of the crushed bones of their enemies. The classroom itself is a testament to interspecies accommodation. Desks of varying sizes, atmospheric controls for different breathing requirements, and translation matrices that can handle everything from ultrasonic whistles to interpretive color changes. It should be a place of learning and growth. Instead, it has become Brandon's personal coliseum, where he selects victims with the casual efficiency of a farmer choosing which vegetables to harvest. But this semester promised to be different, according to the rumor mill that keeps our school's social ecosystem functioning. Apparently a transfer student was joining our class. Not just any transfer student, mind you, but a human. Now humans were something of a legend around Galactic Academy Prime. Everyone had heard stories, but nobody had actually seen one in person. They were supposed to be some kind of death world species, evolved from a planet so ridiculously hostile that it produced creatures capable of surviving literally anything. The rumors painted them as unstoppable warriors, brilliant strategists, and pack hunters who could adapt to any environment. Of course, rumors also claimed that Shimmer had actually been made of real crystal instead of just having a crystalline appearance, so we all took these stories with several grains of salt. As I settled into my carefully chosen seat in the back corner of Commander Marley's classroom, maximum distance from Brandon's usual throne-like desk at the front, I wondered what this mysterious human would be like. Would they be as terrifying as Brandon? More terrifying? Would they team up and turn our classroom into some kind of predator tag team nightmare? I was about to find out, and every single one of my herbivore instincts was screaming that I should have called in sick today. The door to Commander Marley's classroom slid open with its usual pneumatic hiss, and in walked what had to be the biggest anticlimax in the history of interspecies education. Amy Kowalski stood maybe 5 feet tall on a good day, and today was apparently not a good day, because she seemed to be slouching slightly. She had pale skin, brown hair tied back in what humans apparently call a ponytail, and was wearing the standard academy uniform that somehow managed to look both too big and too small on her compact frame. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be an ancient metal container with a hinged lid, decorated with faded images of something called Hello Kitty. This was it. This was the legendary Death World Warrior we had all been whispering about.
I have seen more intimidating organisms growing in the Academy cafeteria's ventilation system.
The classroom fell into the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for witnessing natural disasters or particularly spectacular academic failures. 43 different species representing billions of years of evolution all simultaneously reached the same conclusion. Somebody had made a terrible mistake. Amy seemed completely oblivious to the attention she was receiving. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room with the casual interest of someone choosing produce at a market. Her gaze passed over Brandon Torres without so much as a pause, which should have been our first warning sign. Every other student in the academy had developed the survival instinct to at least acknowledge Brandon's presence, even if only to calculate escape routes. But Amy was apparently more concerned with finding a seat that met her mysterious human standards. "Oh good," she said, and her voice had a pleasant, almost musical quality to it. "There's a spot by the window." She walked directly across the classroom, passing within arm's reach of Brandon Torres, who was currently experiencing what I could only describe as predator whiplash. Here was Brandon, 12 feet of perfectly evolved killing machine, being completely ignored by something that looked like it should be asking for directions to the nearest petting zoo. The other students' reactions were a fascinating study in xenopsychology. Moran, a fellow Verdanian, had turned the particular shade of green that indicated he was trying to figure out whether he should feel sorry for the new student or start planning her memorial service. Morton, who belonged to a species of armored herbivores with excellent survival instincts, had already begun the slow process of backing toward the door. The aquatic students were bubbling nervously in their environmental suits. The gaseous entities were literally becoming less dense, which in their species indicated either extreme confusion or preparation for rapid dispersal. Even the machine intelligence students were running probability calculations that kept coming up with error messages. Commander Marley, bless his optimistic centaurian heart, chose this moment to attempt classroom management. Class, please welcome our new student, Amy Kowalski, who joins us from the Sol system. Amy, would you like to introduce yourself? Amy had reached her chosen desk by the window and was carefully placing her lunch container in the storage compartment. She looked up with a bright smile that somehow managed to be both completely innocent and vaguely unsettling. Hi everyone, I'm Amy. I'm really excited to be here. My grandmother packed me lunch today, so I'm having a great morning already. She said this with the kind of genuine enthusiasm usually reserved for small children discussing their favorite toys. It was adorable. It was sweet. It was also apparently the final straw for Brandon Torres's predator ego. Brandon had spent the last few minutes trying to process what was happening. In his worldview, there were hunters and prey, predators and food. Amy clearly fell into the food category, but she was acting like she had never received that memo. Worse, she was acting like Brandon himself was part of the furniture rather than a carefully evolved engine of destruction. This would not stand. Brandon rose from his desk with the fluid grace of something designed by natural selection to kill things efficiently. The movement sent ripples of panic through the classroom, as students who had been merely nervous suddenly upgraded to actively seeking divine intervention. Well, Brandon said, his voice carrying the low rumble that had convinced 3 different species to consider transferring to other schools. Look what we have here. A tiny little human, all alone, so far from home. Amy looked up from her desk arrangement with mild curiosity. Oh, hi there. You're really tall. Do you play basketball? My cousin Jake is tall, and he plays basketball. The casual tone of her response hit the classroom like a sonic weapon. Several students actually winced. Commander Marley made a noise that sounded like air escaping from a punctured tire. I personally felt my grass-eating ancestors spinning in their composted graves. Brandon's massive frame seemed to swell with indignation. Here he was, putting on his best intimidation display, and Amy was asking about recreational sports. This was either the bravest or the most obliviously suicidal behavior any of us had ever witnessed. I don't play games, little human, Brandon growled, taking a step closer to Amy's desk. I collect interesting things. Trophies, you might say. Amy nodded politely. That's nice. I collect bottle caps from different worlds. I've got 17 so far. Do you want to see them sometime? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, which was impressive considering we had atmospheric controls. Brandon Torres, apex predator extraordinaire, was being offered a bottle cap collection viewing by his intended victim. This was not going according to anyone's expectations. Brandon Torres had faced down 3 different species of armored war beasts, intimidated creatures twice his size, and once made a professor from the military academy cry just by staring at him during office hours. He was not about to be defeated by a 5-foot human with a bottle cap collection. With the kind of casual arrogance that had made him the undisputed terror of Galactic Academy Prime, Brandon reached across Amy's desk and plucked her lunch container right out of her hands. What do we have here? Brandon said, holding the metal box up like a trophy. The Hello Kitty images caught the classroom's artificial lighting, creating tiny rainbows that somehow made the whole situation even more surreal. Let's see what passes for food on this primitive death world of yours. Amy blinked once, twice, then tilted her head slightly to the side. Oh, she said in the same tone someone might use when noticing it had started raining. Could I have that back, please? Her voice was perfectly polite, perfectly calm, and perfectly reasonable. It was also somehow the most terrifying thing I had ever heard in my entire academic career. Brandon laughed, the sound echoing off the classroom walls like rocks in a tumbler. Please? Did this little human just say please? He turned to address the rest of the class, still holding Amy's lunch container. Did you all hear that? The legendary Death World warrior is asking nicely for her food back. Several students had begun that slow, careful migration toward the exits that herbivores perfect when predators start acting unpredictably. The aquatic students were actually vibrating in their suits, which in their species indicated either extreme distress or preparation for emergency evacuation, possibly both. Amy remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her desk, watching Brandon with the kind of patient attention usually reserved for observing interesting weather patterns. Brandon popped open the lunch container with his claws, making a show of examining the contents. Look at this primitive sustenance, he announced, pulling out what appeared to be a sandwich wrapped in some kind of thin, transparent material. Bread, meat, vegetables. How pedestrian, how utterly lacking in sophistication. He held up a small thermos, shaking it experimentally. And what's this? Some kind of liquid? Probably water. How boring. Where I come from, we consume the essence of our prey while it's still warm. Amy's expression didn't change, but something in the air seemed to shift. It was subtle, like the moment before lightning strikes when all the hair on your body stands up, except none of us had hair and the sensation was coming from somewhere much deeper than our nervous systems. My grandmother made that lunch, Amy said quietly. She got up early this morning to make sure I had enough food for my first day. She even made extra portions in case I wanted to share with new friends. Brandon paused in his examination of the lunch contents. For just a moment, something that might have been confusion flickered across his predatory features. Then he shook his massive head and returned to his performance. "Your grandmother?" Brandon sneered. "Oh, how touching. The little human misses her family. Tell me, tiny death, world creature, what exactly do you think your grandmother could do if she were here right now? Knit me a sweater? Bake me cookie?" He made an exaggerated show of opening the thermos and sniffing its contents. "Smells like vegetable soup. How utterly pathetic. This is what passes for nutrition among your species." Amy's hands remained folded, but I noticed her knuckles had gone slightly white. "Could I please have my lunch back?" she asked again. This time, there was something different in her tone. It was still polite, still reasonable, still perfectly calm, but there was an edge to it now, like the difference between a butter knife and a scalpel. Both are utensils, both have their purposes, but only one is designed to cut through things that don't want be cut. Brandon, apparently lacking the survival instincts that billions of years of evolution had attempted to install in him, completely missed the warning signs. "Please?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Oh, the little human is getting upset about her lunch. What are you going to do if I don't give it back? Cry? Call for help? Write a strongly worded complaint to the administration?" The other students had stopped their migration toward the exits, not because they felt safer, but because they had suddenly realized that moving might attract attention, and attracting attention in this moment seemed like the kind of mistake that natural selection was specifically designed to punish. Moran had turned a shade of green I didn't know was possible for our species. Moran had retracted completely into his shell, leaving only his eyes visible. Even Commander Marley had stopped trying to regain control of his classroom, and was instead reaching very slowly toward what I assumed was the emergency alert button hidden under his desk. Amy stood up. It was such a simple action, such an ordinary movement, but it sent a collective shudder through every survival instinct in the room. She rose from her chair with the fluid grace of something that was perfectly comfortable with its place in the universe, and that place, we were all beginning to realize, might not be where we had initially assumed. "I asked you nicely," Amy said, still in that same perfectly reasonable tone. "Twice." Brandon looked down at her from his 12-foot height, still holding her lunch container, still apparently convinced that he was the apex predator in this situation. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, little human? You're barely tall enough to reach my knees." Amy smiled. It was a perfectly pleasant smile, the kind you might give to a helpful store clerk or a particularly cute pet. It was also the most absolutely terrifying expression I had ever seen on any creature's face in my entire life. "Well," Amy said, "I suppose we'll find out, won't we?" For a moment that stretched like taffy in a gravitational field, nobody moved. Amy stood beside her desk, still smiling that perfectly pleasant, absolutely horrifying smile. Brandon loomed over her, still clutching her lunch container, apparently trying to process what had just happened to his carefully orchestrated intimidation routine. "You know," Amy said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than standing on the precipice of what every survival instinct in the room was screaming would be a complete disaster, "my grandmother has a philosophy about food." Brandon blinked, which was impressive given that his species had evolved beyond the need for such expressions of confusion. "A philosophy about food?" "Oh yes," Amy nodded, still maintaining that serene expression. "She believes that when you cook for someone, you're putting a little piece of your love into every ingredient. Every stir of the spoon, every careful measurement, every moment of attention. She says food made with love doesn't just nourish the body, it nourishes the soul." The classroom had become so quiet that I could hear the environmental systems cycling air, the distant hum of the Academy's artificial gravity generators, and what sounded suspiciously like Mortin praying in his native tongue from inside his shell. Brandon, perhaps sensing that this conversation had taken a turn he wasn't prepared for, decided to double down on his original strategy. "How touching," he sneered, giving the lunch container a casual shake. "Your grandmother's philosophy. Very primitive, very emotional, very weak. That was when he made his mistake. While gesturing dismissively with Amy's lunch container, Brandon's massive claw caught the edge of the thermos. The container that held what Amy had mentioned was her grandmother's homemade soup, the carefully prepared liquid that represented hours of patient work, made with love by an elderly human who had risen early to ensure her granddaughter had proper nutrition on her first day at a new school. The thermos slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the sudden vacuum of silence that had engulfed the classroom. Amy's expression changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but every single creature in that room, representing dozens of different species with millions of years of evolutionary experience in recognizing predator behavior, suddenly understood that they were witnessing something shift from prey to hunter. The smile remained. The pleasant tone stayed exactly the same. But something behind Amy's eyes had gone very, very cold. "Oh," Amy said softly, looking down at the spreading puddle of soup on the classroom floor. "You spilled my grandmother's soup." Brandon seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that he might have miscalculated something fundamental about this situation. But he was 12 feet of apex predator pride, and apex predators don't back down from creatures that barely reach their kneecaps. "Accidents happen, little human," he growled, though there was slightly less conviction in his voice than before. Amy knelt down beside the spill, apparently studying the wasted soup with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for complex mathematical problems. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow student. "You see, Brandon," she said, still crouched beside the puddle, "humans have this concept called pack bonding. It's a bit complicated, so I'll try to explain it in terms you might understand." She stood up slowly, deliberately, her movements carrying none of the casual cheerfulness they had displayed earlier. "When humans form emotional attachments, we don't just care about the individual, we adopt them into our pack structure, and when someone threatens or disrespects a member of our pack, especially a vulnerable member like an elderly grandmother, who got up before dawn to show love through carefully prepared food." Amy paused, tilting her head slightly, as if considering how best to phrase her next words. "That triggers certain instinctual responses that your species probably doesn't have, given that draconians are primarily solitary hunters." Brandon was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable, though he was far too proud to admit it. "Are you threatening me, little human?" "Oh no," Amy said, and her smile widened just a fraction. "I'm educating you. You see, my grandmother is 87 years old. She has arthritis in both hands, which means stirring soup causes her physical pain. But she did it anyway, because she loves me, and wanted to make sure I was properly fed on my first day at a new school." The other students had abandoned any pretense of staying for educational purposes. Moran had actually achieved a shade of green that I was fairly certain violated several laws of physics. The machine intelligence students were broadcasting emergency signals. Even Commander Marley had given up on maintaining order and was apparently trying to figure out whether his emergency alert system could summon enough security to handle whatever was about to happen. "She also included extra portions," Amy continued in that same perfectly reasonable tone, "because she hoped I might make friends who would appreciate homemade food. Because that's what grandmothers do, Brandon. They show love through sacrifice and hope their grandchildren will find kindness in the world." Brandon Torres, apex predator extraordinaire, was beginning to look like he wanted to be anywhere else in the galaxy, but pride is a terrible thing, and apex predators have more pride than most. "So what?" he snarled, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "It's just food, just soup. What are you going to do about some spilled soup?" Amy looked up at him then, and I swear I could see something ancient and terrible stirring behind her perfectly ordinary human eyes, something that had evolved on a death world where everything was trying to kill everything else, where only the most ruthlessly efficient survivors had lived long enough to pass on their genes. "What am I going to do?" Amy repeated softly. "Well, Brandon, I'm going to teach you about another human concept. It's called proportional response." Brandon, finally sensing that perhaps he had bitten off more than he could chew, decided to fall back on what had always worked before: physical intimidation. He drew himself up to his full 12 feet, spread his massive arms to display his natural weapons, and let out a roar that had once made a crystalline professor literally shatter from fear. Amy didn't even flinch. "Oh good," she said brightly. "You want to do this the traditional way. What happened next will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my natural lifespan, and possibly beyond if my species' theories about consciousness transference prove accurate." Brandon Torres lunged forward with the kind of devastating attack that had made him the undisputed terror of 3 different star systems. 12 feet of perfectly evolved killing machine, claws extended, fangs bared, moving with the fluid grace of something designed by natural selection to end other things permanently. Amy stepped sideways. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a simple, economical movement that put her exactly where Brandon wasn't. His claws raked through empty air with enough force to have shredded steel plating, and Brandon found himself stumbling forward, thrown off balance by his own momentum. That should have been the end of it. A lucky dodge, a moment's reprieve before the inevitable conclusion. Except Amy wasn't done moving. What followed was less a fight and more a masterclass in applied violence that no educational institution should ever have to witness. Amy moved like she had been studying Brandon's attack patterns her entire life, flowing around his strikes with an efficiency that was both beautiful and absolutely terrifying. But it wasn't just her movement that shocked me into a state of existential crisis. It was what happened when Brandon's claws did connect. The first strike caught Amy across the shoulder, tearing through her academy uniform and leaving 3 parallel gashes that should have sent her to the medical bay immediately. Amy looked down at the wounds with mild interest, as if someone had pointed out that she had spilled something on her shirt. "Huh," she said conversationally, while bleeding. "That's going to stain." Then she grabbed Brandon's extended arm and used it as leverage to swing herself up and drive her knee directly into what I assumed were some of his more sensitive areas. Brandon's roar of pain echoed through the classroom like a sonic weapon. Several students who hadn't already evacuated finally got the message and began scrambling for the exits. The gaseous entities dispersed entirely, probably reforming somewhere in the next system. But Amy wasn't finished demonstrating human combat doctrine. While Brandon was still processing the fact that something a fraction of his size had just caused him significant pain, Amy had somehow acquired one of the desk legs, not removed it carefully, not unscrewed it methodically, but simply grabbed it and twisted it free with her bare hands like she was opening a particularly stubborn jar. "You know what's interesting about persistence hunting?" Amy asked cheerfully, now armed with an improvised club, while Brandon clutched his wounded dignity. "It's not about being faster or stronger than your prey, it's about outlasting them." She swung the desk leg in a casual arc that Brandon barely avoided. The improvised weapon struck the wall behind him hard enough to leave a dent in the reinforced material. "Humans evolved to chase things until they collapsed from exhaustion," Amy continued, advancing on Brandon with measured steps. "We're not the fastest runners in the galaxy, or the strongest, or the most naturally armed, but we don't quit, ever." Brandon tried his traditional intimidation roar again, but this time it came out as more of a whimper. He was beginning to understand that he was facing something completely outside his experience. All his natural advantages, his size, his claws, his evolved predator instincts, were proving useless against an opponent who simply refused to behave like prey. Commander Marley, bless his optimistic soul, chose this moment to attempt intervention. Students, please remember that violence is not the Academy way. We resolve conflicts through dialogue and mutual understanding." Amy paused in her methodical advance and looked over at the teacher with genuine confusion. "Oh, we're past dialogue, Commander Marley. Brandon spilled my grandmother's soup. We're into practical demonstration territory now." She returned her attention to Brandon, who was now backing toward the corner of the classroom with the growing realization that he might not survive his educational experience. "The really fascinating thing about human combat behavior," Amy said, still speaking in that perfectly reasonable teacher voice, while stalking a 12-foot apex predator, "is that we don't just fight until we win. We fight until the threat is completely neutralized." Brandon's back hit the wall, and for the first time in his academic career, He found himself looking around desperately for escape routes. Unfortunately, Amy had positioned herself between him and the exits, with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested this wasn't her first time cornering prey. Somewhere in the distance, emergency alarms began wailing throughout the academy. Security protocols activated, blast doors sealed, and automated systems began broadcasting warnings about a code-red interspecies incident in the Universal Literature Wing. But all of that seemed very far away as Amy raised her improvised club and smiled that terrible, pleasant smile. "Now then, Brandon," she said sweetly, "shall we discuss proper etiquette when handling other people's lunches?" 20 minutes later, Brandon Torres sat huddled in the corner of the classroom, making soft whimpering sounds that I had never heard from an apex predator before, and frankly hoped never to hear again. His 12 feet of evolved killing machine had been reduced to something that looked like it wanted to call for its mother, assuming draconians had mothers and didn't just spontaneously generate from nightmares. Amy, meanwhile, had returned to her desk and was methodically examining the contents of her lunch container with the focused attention of a forensic investigator. "Well," she said with a disappointed sigh, "the sandwich is fine and the cookies are unharmed, but the soup is completely ruined." She held up the empty thermos with genuine sadness. "Grandmother is going to be so upset. She always asks how I like the soup." The casual tone of her voice was somehow more terrifying than anything that had happened during the actual violence. Here was a creature who had just systematically dismantled a 12-foot apex predator and was now concerned about disappointing her grandmother over spilled soup. Commander Marley was sitting at his desk staring blankly at his lesson plans, as if trying to figure out whether interspecies literature appreciation covered what to do when one of your students completely redefined the food chain during class time. The poor Centaurian looked like he was seriously reconsidering his career choices. The few students who had been brave enough or too shocked to flee were now maintaining a respectful distance from Amy that I calculated to be roughly equivalent to Brandon's former intimidation radius. The difference was that Brandon had inspired fear through threat of violence. Amy had inspired terror through demonstration of competence. The Academy's emergency response team had arrived approximately 15 minutes too late to be relevant, though they did provide excellent documentation of the aftermath. I watched through the reinforced classroom windows as various administrators huddled together in urgent consultation, occasionally gesturing toward Amy with the kind of respectful wariness usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. "You know," Amy said, carefully rewrapping her sandwich, "I really hate wasting food. Grandmother always taught me that food is precious, and wasting it is disrespectful to everyone who worked to provide it." She glanced over at Brandon, who immediately tried to make himself smaller in his corner. "But I suppose some lessons are more important than soup." What followed over the next few days was perhaps the most dramatic shift in Academy social dynamics that anyone could remember. Brandon Torres, former terror of 3-star systems, had apparently decided that his new role in life was to serve as Amy's unofficial bodyguard. Not because she needed protection, obviously. After what we had all witnessed, the idea that Amy Kowalski required protection from anything was laughable. No, Brandon followed her around because he had developed the survival instinct that he apparently should have been born with. Stay close to the apex predator so it doesn't decide you're a threat. It was actually quite touching in a deeply disturbing way. Brandon would lurk behind Amy at a respectful distance, glaring menacingly at anyone who looked like they might be considering disturbing her lunch. He had apparently appointed himself as the guardian of grandmother's food, a position he took very seriously. Amy, for her part, had returned to her cheerful, oblivious demeanor the moment the lunch situation was resolved. She attended classes, participated in discussions, and shared her cookies with anyone who seemed friendly. The transformation was so complete that if you hadn't witnessed the violence personally, you might think the stories were exaggerated. But we had all seen it. We knew what lurked beneath that pleasant exterior. The Academy administration held emergency meetings for a week straight, trying to figure out how to classify what had happened. Was it self-defense? Disproportionate response? A cultural misunderstanding? Eventually they settled on listing it as an educational demonstration of interspecies communication techniques, and quietly updated the student handbook to include a section on respecting cultural food traditions. The real revelation, though, came when I started researching human society and realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Humans, those legendary death world warriors we had all heard stories about, those persistence hunters who could survive anything their nightmare planet threw at them, those pack-bonding killers who formed emotional attachments to their prey, had decided that their ideal companions were small, fluffy creatures that served no practical purpose except to provide emotional comfort. They called them pets, cats, dogs, hamsters, birds, creatures that any sensible species would classify as either food or minor annoyances. But humans had looked at these small, vulnerable animals and said, "Yes, I will form an unbreakable emotional bond with this creature and become violently protective of its welfare." If humans could pack bond with random small animals, what did that say about their capacity for forming attachments to friends, to family, to elderly grandmothers who got up early to make soup? On my third day of classes with Amy, she offered me half of her sandwich. It was delicious, clearly made with love and careful attention to flavor. As I ate it, I realized I was probably the safest student in the entire academy. After all, I was now part of Amy Kowalski's pack. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to mess with Amy's lunch again.